Hello brothers and sisters, and today we consider the meaning of one of the more memorable phrases from George Orwell's 1984. Could the phrase be a useful link between events that may reveal a creepy, early encounter involving Winston and O'Brien? Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we'll consider the deeper meaning of this phrase and another darker possibility based on the lore. The first quote we shall consider is the following. Quote, "Years ago, how long was it? 7 years it must be? He had dreamed he was walking through a pitch-dark room, and someone sitting to one side of him had said as he passed, 'We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness.'" What's interesting at this early stage is that Winston doesn't really grasp the phrase's meaning, though he was certain that the prediction would somehow come true. Vaguely too, Winston is unsure whether he had seen O'Brien for the first time before or after having the dream. This is important, as if he had not, then his identification of O'Brien as the voice that uttered the phrase would be odd. It would have to be false, as how could he dream of a man's voice who he had yet to see or hear? We'll get back to that though. Assuming Winston had seen O'Brien around about the time before he had had his dream and had been quite impressed by him, as we know he would remain up into the plot of the novel itself, this makes perfect sense. Even if his recollection is a false memory of sorts, the phrasing is a bit random to have come from nowhere, especially when later on in his meeting with O'Brien seems unsurprised at the phrase when Winston suggests it. Quote, "There are a couple of minutes before you need go," said O'Brien. "We shall meet again, if we do meet again." Winston looked up at him. "In the place where there is no darkness?" he said hesitantly. O'Brien nodded without appearance of surprise. "In the place where there is no darkness," he said, as though he had recognized the allusion. This section of Part 2, Chapter 8 is essential to understand if the theory I am about to imminently suggest is to be entertained. Namely, O'Brien is perfectly aware of what the phrase really means, and so are we as readers. We know that it refers to the windowless and perpetually lit interior of the dreaded Ministry of Love, something Winston later realizes too. A side issue here then is why Winston did not have alarm bells ringing in his ears at O'Brien's seemingly blatant, almost cocky admission of his understanding of the phrase here. From what we know, only Winston knows this phrase, and even then from a vague and unexplained source. He simply heard it in a dream and perhaps constructed a false memory of it with O'Brien's voice. This seems strange to me. We know that the phrase is probably not common, like the bone-chilling Room 101, as Winston struggles to understand its meaning from the opening of the novel. In Chapter 2 of Part 1, it's mysterious, and given he associates it with O'Brien, who at this stage Winston hopes could be a secret thought criminal, he later interprets the phrase as a source of hope, again linking it to O'Brien. Quote, "The place where there is no darkness was the imagined future, which one would never see, but which, by foreknowledge, one could mystically share in." This thought, in Part 1, Chapter 8, is also important for two reasons, as, firstly, it again links with the meeting with O'Brien, which I shall explain presently, but also as Winston was writing in his diary at the time, or at the very least is implied to be. It specifically states a couple of paragraphs back, quote, "He opened the diary. It was important to write something down." The question is then, did Winston transfer this particular thought, our quote, into his diary? Because if he did, then this attachment to the phrase and his present association of a better future with it would then be known to the thought police and O'Brien, who we later find out had been monitoring Winston closely for 7 years and have been reading his diary too. Indeed, Winston later reveals that even the whitish speck of dust he placed on the cover to help him detect if anybody had read it had been carefully replaced to avoid his suspicions. Zipping back to the meeting scene, we read O'Brien using very similar phrasing to Winston's idea of what the phrase means. Quote, "We are the dead. Our only true life is in the future. We shall take part in it as handfuls of dust and splinters of bone, but how far away that future may be, There is no knowing. To me, this is too on the mark to be pure coincidence. Remember, at this point, from Winston's and our perspective, Winston has only even spoken to O'Brien twice, the present time included. Now he seems to be confirming Winston's idea of a future linked to the phrase we are considering. This is Communist Parade red flags territory, as not only does O'Brien say what Winston wants to hear, but shows no surprise in his use of the phrase. I submit to you then that the reason O'Brien is not surprised is that he did indeed say the actual phrase that Winston heard in his dream, though I don't think it was a dream, or if it was, the dream was suggested by O'Brien himself before he had even met Winston. How could this be? Well, we know how sensitive telescreens can be. Winston himself relates that they can pick up the sound of a raised heartbeat. We also know for a fact they can be targeted to particular individuals. Winston's is used by the instructress to bark at him for not touching his toes. What if O'Brien had spoken the phrase to Winston through his telescreen? Telescreens, as Winston explains near the opening of the novel, cannot be switched off, though they can be dimmed somewhat. Note too the timing of both the dream and the date at which the Fort Police began to monitor Winston. Winston was told he had been under the gaze of the Fort Police for 7 years. Quote, he knew now that for 7 years the Fort Police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass. Also, when in the Ministry of Love later on, we even get an eerie parallel to the earlier dream which Winston links directly to it. Quote, and once, Winston could not remember whether it was in drugged sleep or in normal sleep, or even in a moment of wakefulness, a voice murmured in his ear, don't worry, Winston, you are in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect. He was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him, we shall meet in the place where there is no darkness, in that other dream 7 years ago. I think this is a rare instance where we can reasonably dispel Orwell's ambiguity here, as we know Winston associates the phrase and that earlier dream with O'Brien. This, coupled with O'Brien's knowledge of the phrase in the meeting. As we know, he directed Winston's interrogation. Indeed, the latter quote is in the context of Winston musing that O'Brien was many things at that time, including inquisitor, friend and tormentor, and it all does indicate that O'Brien must have also creepily uttered the phrase to Winston whilst in sleep or half-sleep. Perhaps 7 years before, Winston's case had been presented to O'Brien, and he had eagerly taken it up. In another linking phrase, O'Brien also says during the interrogation itself, quote, this drama that I have played out with you during 7 years will be played out over and over again, generation after generation, always in subtler forms. This drama, the word betrays how O'Brien likely sees the whole affair. It's all a game, an exercise in power that the inner party and himself exists for. It's no surprise then that the opening of this game, this whole drama, should begin with the hunter speaking directly to his prey through his very own telescreen. It all makes sense anyway, O'Brien's unsurprised confirmation of the phrase itself at the meeting, a confirmation that can't be explained in any other way, bar the phrase being a common one, which it can't be, as part of the point of it is that it remained mysterious to Winston until his interrogation. We also had the mirroring of Winston's erroneous interpretation of it as indicative of some brighter future that O'Brien uses. And finally, Orwell seems careful to have the dates align too, and provides an otherwise arbitrary demonstration fairly early on of the telescreen being used to directly communicate with Winston in his home through the instructress. What I think we can say then is that 7 years before his capture, O'Brien directly uttered the phrase to Winston while he slept or was half awake, and that's why he associated it with O'Brien from the first. Going back full circle, remember Winston is unsure whether he saw O'Brien for the first time before or after his dream. Well, now after could be explained, as the answer is no. but he had heard O'Brien before then. If this is all true then, and O'Brien both suggested the phrase and used it as another layer of manipulation over the years he toyed with Winston, what does it all mean as an overall moral for the story? Well, since the novel itself is Orwell's warning about totalitarianism, this subtle form of psychological manipulation is a further demonstration of the horrors of absolute state control, that not only does the party control Winston's body, but was even influencing his thoughts from before the novel had even started. So that was my whole theory behind The Place Where There Is No Darkness. But what do you think? Do all the puzzle pieces fit to indicate O'Brien creepily spoke to Winston while he slept 7 years before Chapter 1? Or are there other explanations for his knowledge of the words and his lack of surprise? Write your thoughts in the comments as ever. If you found this video plus good, then give it a thumbs up by hitting that like button. And if double plus good, then consider subscribing for notifications on future videos. Thanks for listening, and if we meet again, it shall be in the place where there is no darkness.